exactly are Cape Verdeans, and how did they end up in Massachusetts?
Well, a lot of them came over on the whaling ships, right, Moses?
For 200
my
plus
family.
years, yeah.
Yeah, at the turn of the century, they were whalers. They came in through New Bedford. But
That was our Ellis Island. New Bedford was the biggest port.
Yeah.
And my family ended up, they stayed in Wareham, Onset. And getting back to what you said, Senator, I think the city of Brockton opened up to them in the late 30s, early 40s. They thought it was a shoe industry. There's industry here. I'm leaving this farmland, and instead of being a farmer, I'm going to go be an industrial worker.
And
that's what my family did in the 30s. And at that time, I think there were maybe 4 or 5 maybe Cape Verdean families in the whole city, if that.
You know where had a large Cape Verdean population was Scituate. It had a big association. I found out what my great-grandfather looked like because of a photo from 1952 from the Cape Verdean Association. And they used to all dress up. And if you looked at the crowd, the only reason why I knew who he looks just like my uncle. So like it skipped a generation. So my Uncle Nene looked like his grandfather. And it's just, I think what the story is the whaling and then the cranberry bogs and then working in the industrial. A lot of people went into the Army and the armed forces because the Navy, that's why there's a lot of Cape Verdeans in Sacramento. California.
Yeah, Southern California.
There's people in Ohio. There was
Diego.
major points of industry that people just got spread around.
I'm sure it helped a little bit that it was warmer in those places.
And it was like Cape Verde.
Well, no, because we have Cape Verdeans in Wisconsin and places like that. You know, Ohio is not that much warmer than we are. You know?
But for people that made the choice to go to Florida, for example, there's a big community now in Georgia. I have 2 siblings, and there's a whole community there.
So Angela, growing up, did you know this history that we're talking about?
I did, just because I'm first generation born here. My parents are from Cape Verde. My dad came in, the 70s. My mom came in the 80s. So I knew what it was. Luckily for me, I grew up in Brockton, so there was a big population kind of everywhere you go. Right. It's like maybe 1 in 4 is Cape Verdean. So when you talk to people from Brockton, they know who Cape Verdeans are. But when I was going to college and stuff like that, just outside the state, you're like, oh, I'm Cape Verdean. You encounter that same thing. You're what? Yeah. What are you?
Cape
I've
God?
never heard of that. Yeah.
Thank God.
Where did you go to school? You went out of state?
I got accepted to UConn. Yeah. I decided not to go. I actually went to Bridgewater, which is,
as now growing as the #1 school.
So I'm a Bridgewater alumni. Yeah.
Very interesting. So I know these are different generations, but in the early 80s, I went to Howard University, an all-black school, and even there...
You went there when Vice President Kamala Harris was there.
Sure did, right. We were in the same class. And most people there had no idea what Cape Verde was.
Oh, yeah.
My college roommate from Nigeria, I said, you're from Nigeria. We're part of the Organization of African States. You never heard of that? He said, no. But then again, he was raised in England, so he said,
yeah.
But
I don't know you're HU. There's like a big contingency in the 90s of Howard Cape Verdean alums.
I actually got into Howard. I got into Howard.
I did too. They never gave me my deposit back. So.
Okay, so get Howard on the phone. So how does that translate in terms of identity? Because like you're coming, some people, right, are coming from Cape Verde to the U.S., and in your case, you grew up here. You were born here. You as well, and you as well. You're the only one who was.
And my parents were born here.
Your parents
and
were
my
born
grandparents were not.
But as people come, or as people acclimate to American culture, which we know is often so much, you're black or you're white, right, and everything else sort of falls around that. How does that apply here?
Well, you know what? One of the things when you were talking about being Cape Verde, not Cape Verde, Cape Cod, whatever, one of the things that we have become is great drawers of maps. You know, because when you say to somebody, I'm Cape Verdean, and the next thing is like, where is that? You know, where is that located? So usually you get up and you say, okay, so this is Africa. See the little forehead? We're right here, where all the hurricanes come from. So we have become great drawers of maps. You know, to basically explain to folks exactly where we come from. Because again, we should be better known here in the U.S. because Cape Verdeans have been in the U.S. since the days of Columbus. You know, through some of the voyages of Columbus, there's actually a history of them coming through, picking up supplies and manpower or whatever to shoot across the Atlantic back in the days of Columbus. So we've been here for a long time. The problem is like we were talking, is that whole identity thing. The country did not become a country on its own since until 1975.
Right, just 50 years ago.
So anybody that was born prior to or was associated with the country prior to 75, you were kind of Portuguese from this place called Cape Verde. So no one knew of Cape Verdeans. They've known of these folks that came from this place called Cape Verde, but not as Cape Verdean nationals. And I think that's the difference, is that we were not known, his parents or grandparents, in the sense, they were not Cape Verdeans, because there was no such place
And to this
as
day,
Cape Verde.
they may
And to
still
this place, they
identify
might still
as
identify themselves as
Portuguese.
Black Portuguese or darker Portuguese or Portuguese from this place called Cape Verde.
Or in some cases even, I'll tell you, my birth certificate, until I finally saw it, and I was a teenager, had me down as white, Portuguese.
Right. Because they're, Portuguese.
And I'm thinking to myself, well, I don't look white. I'm not white. And eventually we changed that around. But I think that for a lot of people born in the 50s, 40s, 60s, I was born in the 60s, I think, and you lived in the Northeast or wherever, Cape Verde, I think, you saw that. They asked your mother, well, what am I going to put down? Portuguese. So
Right.
That's what they put down.
And see here, the Cape Verdean population in Brockton has helped make it the first majority Black city in New England, right? So I guess I'm curious if that identity, if it almost becomes like a lumping, or is it something that is an evolution over time?
Well, I think it has been an evolution, because I'll tell you, Brocktonians know
Okay, sorry.
Brocktonians know where Cape Verde is. And I'm talking about whites, blacks, pink, or purples.
Everybody knows now.
Oh, yeah,
Everybody
from
knows who
Brockton,
Cape Verdeans are. As a matter of fact, I think even some of the white kids in at the high school often say that everybody knows what cousin means, or what means what.
I just got very nervous. I was like, did we start yet?
No, so at least the populations of Brockton or its surrounding communities have an idea, know exactly what Cape Verde is, know exactly who Cape Verde
Not to
is.
go back, there was I get to tell a story, plenty of stories. When you're older, we are.
Here, tell it.
The show is only 15
I know.
minutes.
So, but the difference, right? Today, in Brockton, everyone knows, and you can probably say Boston, everyone knows what Cape Verdean is too. Today, first grade, they asked you and write down all your favorite foods, and I'm writing down cachupa, manioc, all these Cape Verdean foods, because that's what I ate at the time.
Yep.
And so I get the paper back, and the teacher writes a big red question mark in red pen, and I bring it home, and my parents are just cracking up, and I don't understand. What is it? What's so funny? Because I don't know why she did that. Because, well, of course she doesn't know any of these things that you put out there, and you probably didn't know how to spell it anyway.
For identity, I think about this as a first gen, growing up in Roxbury, where the community was actually in transition. When Cape Verdeans came to Roxbury, many of them chose it because it was the most affordable place. There were some Cape Verdeans there, but not many. But it had just gone through white flight due to busing. When Judge Garrity's decision came down that we needed to desegregate our schools, my neighborhood in Roxbury near South Bay was largely Italian and Irish. And a lot of people burned their homes for profit. Some people just left the homes. There was issues with redlining, urban renewal. So they're coming into a community where they're being told as new immigrants of all different hues. My mom is very white-skinned with blue eyes. My dad was charcoal night, right? And they're coming into this community and they're told, oh, you can't engage, you're different than the blacks from Orchard Park. So you got to be different. And so they're trying to create their own identities.
But how were they being received by Black people?
Well, my uncle tells the story about being shipped from Roxbury to South Boston High School. And they didn't know what he was. So he didn't speak Spanish. So he's like, I got beat up by everybody. He's like, the Puerto Ricans were like, you should speak Spanish. And he looked Puerto Rican, but they were like, you don't speak Spanish. The blacks were like, he was too light-skinned. The whites knew that he had a hint of something. And so those Cape Verdean kids, at the first few years of going to South Boston schools, often talk about the trauma as that their first lesson on what it means to be an immigrant in America is going through the crisis of busing. And so that had a lot to do with, I think, where Cape Verdeans trying to protect their heritage, but also protect their children and their families, being like, okay, we're new and different. And so there's this pride that emerges in Boston where like all Cape Verdeans are like, I'm Cape Verde. I'm not black, I'm not white, I'm Cape Verdean. And this begins to, I think, create a little bit of a divide between the other black populations that were in the city of Boston.
So how does that translate now as we're dealing with our current immigration crisis? What are some of the first lessons that people are learning?
Well,
I think folks are learning that they're not as different as their Haitian brothers and sisters or Nicaraguan brothers and sisters. Cape Verde, although a very democratic nation with great ties to the United States, was just put on a ban list.
Yeah.
Right?
And the yellow part.
I did see that.
Yeah.
And then they had a deportation list where they touted that 300 plus Cape Verdeans were on a list to be deported. And for the first time in my life, about a month ago on a Saturday, ICE was in my neighborhood of Roxbury. Never in a million years would I think that ICE would be in my community. So there's real palpable fears. And the last thing I'll say, that part of it is that Cape Verdeans overstay their visas at a large rate. I think it's over 12% at the moment, and they like to keep it at 4%, right? Try to make it manageable. So there's a lot of people who are working hard, trying to take care of their families, but they might have overstayed a visa. They're not a criminal,
Right.
but they're not going after just criminals, right? They're just going after anybody that they can find, actually.
And that's a good point, because I think one of the pieces that make Cape Verdeans like who they are is whether they came, in Cape Cod or whether they're coming now, they're coming here and they're hard workers. Like, that's one of the things that, like, it's like, oh, describe Cape Verde to me, like, oh, they're hard workers. Like, when it comes down to it, they're very hard workers. So
Some of the people in the community tell me, because I'll ask, where's John? What happened to Maria? Oh, ICE came and got them. What happened? In some of these cases, there are people who are, if they know that that person overextended their visa, they're calling ICE on them.
Oh,
So that's unfortunate. There are cases where that's happening.
that sounds very scary.
It's very scary. So if someone has a disagreement with someone, that can happen. I don't know how widespread it is, but I know about 5 cases where that happened. I think that's unfortunate.
And what are people going back to? Say if they are deported, or even if they just choose to return to Cape Verde 50 years after the country's independence, what's the state of things there?
Well, things aren't bad. When you sit down and think about it, a lot of times the people that are being deported back to the country have very little ties left in the country because they came here as children in some instances. Not a lot of adult arrivals are being deported back to Cape Verde. It's youngsters, kids that came in their preteen, teen ages in the sense that are being deported back. So often they don't have much of anything back home. So the government is having problems with them because they came as saintly kids, and they're going back as professionally, in some instances, professionally trained thugs. So they're having a problem, especially
unique to the U.S.
unique to the U.S., not very unique to the country, to Cape Verde itself. So in a lot of places, especially in places like Brava, even in some places in Fogo, in the sense, not necessarily in Praia, because of the lesser developed areas of the country itself, they're having a real tough time dealing with some of these deportees.
And I have it in my family. I lost my brother and my dad at 18. They both were deported. All my male siblings had interactions with law enforcement. In my neighborhood in the 90s, it was like the war on drugs was a very real thing, and it didn't care whether you were Cape Verdean or you were Latino or you were black. And so a lot of times these young people are actually growing up in the carceral system. And when they're getting deported back to a nation where they don't speak the language, most of their family has already immigrated to a country that actually thinks that they wasted their opportunity, they're often treated like lepers. In April, when I went back, I met with like 20 deportees, and they're having a very difficult time adjusting to a country that, one, says you did a bad thing and there's no second chance here, and then two, not having any support systems on the islands.
Well, we do know there's a lot to celebrate as well. We were talking earlier about how Cape Verde has been able to sustain itself, has become the most, Councilor, you said the most successful democracy in the African continent, Sub-Saharan diaspora. And so What are each of you briefly celebrating this Cape Verdean Independence Day?
I'm celebrating that we got a bill signed into law by the governor to create a CV commission to study the feasibility of creating an art and culture history center in Boston. Tourism is our #1 industry in the Commonwealth, and I want to make sure that that is done right and is advised by as many Cape Verdeans as possible, so that in a year or two, we can actually start working on a building that the millions of people that come to Massachusetts can learn about the history of Cabo Verde.
I mean, I'm celebrating, although I was born here, like I'm celebrating the history of how we got here, right? Even though I was born in the United States, like it's such a rich culture, and that's what I'm celebrating for the 50th anniversary.
I think mine would be the success of the country itself. When you were born in the country, you know what you were born into and what the country has become in the last 50 years or so. It's something that prides me in the sense to be from a place that actually has gone. You know, as I mentioned earlier, when we were talking, there was quite a few people that thought that the country would not be able to survive on its own, away from Portugal in a way, and I think it has proved itself that it can actually do that to a level where you're competing with other countries, not competing militarily, but you're competing with status and statues in a way, democracy. I mean, we had a presidential election back in 2001 that was decided by 12 votes. That's unheard of in today's world in a sense. So it shows that the growth of the country and the growth of its people. So that's what I'm celebrating.
And lastly, Darren.
And I celebrate what a lot of the Cape Verdeans have done here in this country as well. You have a lot of folks who still work and send money home, but then you also have a lot of people who are now doing things 25 years ago, 20 years ago, you didn't see them doing. Running for office and succeeding, becoming surgeons, doctors. I mean, I know Cape Verdeans all over this country who are doing all kinds of great things, but 25, 30 years ago, I couldn't say that. But you can say that now. And not all of them are touting their Cape Verdean heritage. I'd say about half of them do. Half of them you may not even know they're Cape Verdean, but you know by the name and how they look.
I learned Lisa Lopez from TLC.
Right,
Yeah.
yes, exactly.
Yeah, so many.
Yeah, a lot of people did not know that. So, and we did a story here, I'm a former host of Say Brother.
Yes.
When I first came back here, I was gone for many years. And I came back and I noticed the demographic change. This is in the year you were born, 94. And I said, look at this.
I know, yeah.
And at the time, it's interesting that I'm working for the police right now. At the time, there were maybe 8 people of color on the whole force. Fire had maybe 0. Hardly, maybe 1 Cape Verdean. But the Cape Verdean population was huge. It had grown so large compared to when I left there. So when I left there, like some 15, 17 years prior, like I said, no one knew what that was. 15, 17 years later, everybody knew who it was. Today, the Brockton Police, I'd say about a good high 30, 40 some odd % of people of color, mostly Cape Verdean.
The most diversified police force in the state.
Probably the most diversified police force in the state.
Wow. So a lot to celebrate.
A lot to celebrate.
Well, Senator Miranda, Angela, Councilor Rodrigues, and Darren, thank you all so very much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.